For more than half a century, the governments of India and Pakistan have faced each other with suspicion. Each has built large armies equipped with sophisticated U.S. and Soviet weapons. There is the usual array of tanks and artillery, plus nuclear capabilities for both nations. India already has announced that it has atom bombs. Pakistan claims it does not, but the denial seems based on a technicality. They have the components for several atomic bombs, but they have not yet assembled them. If another Indo-Pakistani war breaks out, a hostile use of nuclear weapons, perhaps the first since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, may occur. In 1988, a former officer in India's Ministry of Defense described his country's nuclear potential.
India is now self-sufficient in regard to its nuclear fuel cycle, from mining uranium to recovery of plutonium from spent fuel. It has spent fuel not subject to international controls, and hence the capacity to divert plutonium for bomb making. The Madras reactor alone can be the source for 10 to 20 Hiroshima-sized bombs a year.
As for Pakistan, U.S. Senator Alan Cranston described the situation in 1984.
Following designs stolen in Holland, the Pakistanis built a large centrifuge enrichment plant at Kahuta, near Islamabad, Pakistan's capital. By 1983, they could produce at least 15 kilograms of weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium a year. The Kahuta plant has a current capacity of 45 kilograms of enriched uranium, of which 16 kilograms is deemed more than sufficient for fabricating one nuclear warhead.
Indians and Pakistanis inevitably seem to irritate one another. Pakistanis can never forget India's size. Though Pakistan's population is more than 100 million, India's numbers are climbing toward 1 billion. Pakistanis will often say one Muslim soldier is worth 10 Hindus. Even so, India has defeated Pakistan in 3 wars, which hurts Pakistan's pride and makes the nuclear option more attractive. For Indians, Pakistan's mostly Muslim population represents a constant source of danger. Although more than 105 million Indians also are Muslim, and even though many Muslims serve in India's armed forces, somehow Indians believe that Pakistani Muslims are more violent and unpredictable. A young college-educated Indian recently voiced an opinion which many of his countrymen seem to share. "We should destroy Pakistan now," he said. "They've always caused trouble, and they always will." Young Pakistanis say similar things about India. India wants to be a regional and a world power. In that ambition, China exemplifies India's view of her potential role in the world. Chinese technology and military power may get more media attention, but India surpasses China in many ways. In the 1980s, India was the world's 11th largest industrial economy, the 6th largest producer of steel. It had a favorable balance of international credits. It possessed many more miles of railroad tracks and highways than China. The Indian armed forces have weaponry that's often more sophisticated than that of the People's Republic. India wants to claim a place as one of the great powers, yet its next-door neighbor Pakistan persistently refuses to acknowledge Indian dominance. In a strategy intended to threaten India, Pakistan maintains close military and diplomatic ties with China. India fears that China may develop even greater influence in South Asia. Indians vividly remember that in 1962, China took advantage of a long-standing border dispute to send its army into the mountainous regions of northern India. Unprepared, even unwilling to believe that another third-world country would be so aggressive, India suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Chinese. Even before serious fighting broke out, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru reluctantly addressed the issue of accepting foreign military aid.
There is a fact which might be remembered when people think sometimes of obtaining outside aid. They probably imagine that in my conceit I say that I will not take outside military aid. I certainly have little conceit about India standing on its own legs. I cannot, however, say what we may do in any eventuality, but I do not want the idea to get into our people that others will help us and preserve our freedom. I do not want India to go around on crutches.
Prime Minister Nehru was personally embarrassed when he was forced to accept military aid from the United States. He often had denounced the U.S. as an imperialist power. Internal tensions within both India and Pakistan have only exaggerated these international tensions. Americans and Europeans think of nations as being founded on cultural unity. In France, citizens speak French and adhere to French culture. Germans also share a language and various customs, but none of those familiar ideas apply to India or Pakistan. India's constitution recognizes 15 languages, including Punjabi, Bengali, Marathi, Hindi, Urdu, Tamil, and Telugu. India's constitution states that Hindi should eventually become the national language, yet English is the only commonly understood language in India. In Pakistan, most people speak regional, mutually unintelligible languages such as Punjabi, Sindhi, or Pashto. Relatively few are literate in Pakistan's official national language, Urdu. As in India, English continues to be the favored language for politicians, businessmen, journalists, and intellectuals. This linguistic and cultural diversity contributes to separatist tendencies. Since 1947, when both countries were founded, many groups have aggressively demanded greater regional autonomy or even complete independence. Inhabitants of Pakistan's northwest frontier province, known as Pathans, agitate for their own nation to be called Pakhtunistan. In southwestern Pakistan, the Baluchi people have tried to unite with their cousins in Iran and Afghanistan to create a new country to be called Baluchistan. Over the years, both Baluchis and Pathans have sought independence through guerrilla warfare, forcing Pakistan to commit much of its army just to holding the country together. Pakistan blames India, the Soviet Union, and, ironically, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency for fomenting and sustaining these internal rebellions. In India, some members of the Sikh religious community want to turn the state of Punjab, where Sikhs are the majority, into a new nation called Khalistan. Others want to reverse their own community's 1947 decision to be counted as Hindus in the Indian state. Many Sikhs want the Punjab joined to Pakistan because they believe Pakistan will grant them greater autonomy. Still other Sikhs want to maintain the status quo. Since 1984, militant Sikhs have assassinated opponents, massacred non-Sikhs, planted bombs on crowded buses, and have fought running gun battles with police. The Indian government accuses Pakistan of arming and training the Sikh militants, but Pakistan denies it. The attitude of rebellious Sikhs has been described by Ainsley Embry, a professor of history at Columbia University.
Within the Sikh community, there are elements who see a mammoth plot, one that is deliberately engineered by the ruling Hindu majority. In such a situation, grievances that may be economic or political in origin are perceived as coming from a bias against the Sikhs' religious identity, the very core of their being. A reasonable form of action is to respond to the enemies of one's faith with violence, especially when, as is the case of the so-called Sikh extremists, the government is identified with the Hindu majority.
Similar tensions exist in the Indian state of Kashmir. Located in the mountains and valleys of the northwest, Kashmir is famous for its natural beauty. 90% of Kashmir's population is Muslim, making it the only Indian state with a Muslim majority. But almost all Kashmiris, even non-Muslims, consider themselves culturally distinct, perhaps superior to lowland Indians. Both Muslims and Hindus there seem to favor a completely independent Kashmir. Since 1947, Kashmir has experienced periods of intense conflict, alternating with years of relative calm. But in 1988, 89, and 90, violence reached previously unknown levels. Police and soldiers used brute force to disperse peaceful demonstrations. Many protesters were killed. Mobs attacked police and army barracks. They ambushed individual soldiers or policemen. Some officers took out their frustrations by randomly assaulting ordinary, non-political Kashmiris. Every violent incident created a wave of protest in Pakistan. Leading Muslim religious scholars and politicians held mass meetings demanding that Pakistan's government respond forcefully to India's suppression of Kashmiri human rights. In Pakistan's capital of Islamabad and in India's capital of New Delhi, leaders cannot simply dismiss their people's intense reactions to events in their neighboring state. The Indian and Pakistani central governments both are fragile coalitions. Unfortunately, each compensates for internal weaknesses by blaming its neighbor for all domestic strife. The South Asian landmass has a natural northern boundary established by the Himalayas, the world's highest mountain chain. Even though these mountains seem a formidable barrier, several northwest passes allow entry. The Khyber Pass is the most famous of them, but a number of other entry routes exist. Over the centuries, many migrants and invaders have used these passes to enter South Asia. Soon after crossing the Himalayas, immigrants and would-be conquerors encounter the vast Indo-Gangetic Plain. In the prehistoric period, this area was heavily forested, but human settlement gradually stripped the land of trees. Today, almost no natural forests exist in India. Most surviving trees produce fruit, such as mangoes or bananas. The pulp of palm trees provides the base for local moonshine. The winter climate on most of the Indo-Gangetic Plain is mild, so farmers can grow 2 crops per year when water is available. The British were especially appalled by the conditions in the northern plains during the hot season, April through July, when temperatures routinely exceed 100 degrees. The British novelist H.S. Cunningham wrote this about it.
Vast plains, a dead level, but for an occasional clump of palms or dome of some despoiled and crumbling tomb, stretched away from every side, and ended in a hazy, quivering horizon that spoke of infinite heat. Over these ranged herds of cattle and goats, browsing on what no one could see, or bewildered buffaloes would lie, panting and contented, in some muddy pool, with little but horns, eyes, and nostrils exposed above the surface. Little, ill-begotten, stunted plants worked hard to live and grow and to weather the roaring, fierce winds. The crows sat gasping, open-beaked, as if protesting against having been born into so sulphurous an existence. Here and there, a well, with its huge lumbering water wheel and patient bullocks, went creaking and groaning day and night, as if the earth grudged the tiny stream coming so toilfully from her dry breast, and gave it up only with sighs of pain. The sky was cloudless, pitiless, brazen. The sun rose into it without a fleck of vapor to mitigate its fierceness. All day it shone and glistened and blazed, until the very earth seemed to crack with heat, and the mere thought of it was pain.
In South Asia, water is a precious thing. Between the months of June and October, the subcontinent receives almost all of its rainfall. This is called the monsoon, an English version of the Arabic word mausim, which means season. In a complex cycle involving the Indian landmass, the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Bay of Bengal, storms build up in the east and move west. Especially on the Bay of Bengal, these storms can become cyclones that generate tidal waves. Much of Bengal is a river delta, and the river Hugli can stir up so much silt that it creates many small islands almost overnight. The silt is very fertile, so farmers quickly move onto these bits of land. These tiny places are only a few feet above the level of the water. A tidal wave or even a mild surf created by a monsoon storm can sweep thousands of people to their deaths. For most Indians, however, the arrival of the monsoon is a time of joy. Traditionally, it's the time for lovers, since the rains make it hard to travel or work, and people must stay at home. Husbands who have gone away as soldiers or traders are supposed to return. In the following folk song, one woman laments her husband's absence.
My husband, in what month will you return? My beloved has gone away and returned to the service. He has left me all alone in the house. When the rains came, he took 2 or 4 days' leave. His stay was brief, and he went away at dawn.
In good years, the rains visit every part of South Asia. In bad years, the rains are fickle. They may drown one place while a neighboring region goes dry. So perennial streams, especially those fed by the melting snows of the Himalayas, are crucial to agriculture. In the northwest, the Indus River and 4 other major streams form the area called the Punjab, which literally means the 5 waters. Punjab's fertility is legendary. The region was divided between India and Pakistan in 1947, and the 2 Punjabs remain the breadbaskets of both India and Pakistan. To the southwest of the Punjab, the countryside becomes drier in a region called the Sindh. Agriculture here is difficult unless wells or streams are nearby. The Sindh borders Iran and Afghanistan. Its inhabitants are pastoral nomads who operate small-scale farms. East of the Punjab, the Ganges and the Jumna rivers eventually join the Brahmaputra River, forming the delta region known as Bengal. The northeast, now known as Assam, was a jungle until recent times. India's central region is dominated by a plateau called the Deccan. Mountains to the west of the plateau block most of the annual rains, and the region's bedrock prevents well digging, so the Deccan is sparsely populated. By contrast, both the west and east coasts of India are teeming with people. India's earliest inhabitants were related to the Bushmen of Australia. Later migrants drove them out of the plains, though descendants of the Australians still managed to survive in the hills and jungles. Today, the Mundas, as some of them are called, form one of India's many tribal minorities. Historians know that India was invaded many times, but they're not certain which people came first. Today, the most obvious legacy of these invasions is the distinction between North and South Indian languages. The northern languages, such as Punjabi, Bengali, Sindhi, Marathi, Hindi, and Urdu, are Indo-European languages. Their grammars and vocabularies are related to English, German, and French. But southern languages belong to a completely different language family. Tamil, Telugu, and Malayalam are Dravidian languages with basic structures that differ from northern tongues. These linguistic differences can cause tension. For example, India's Tamil speakers often refuse to learn Hindi, the language of Indian government, because they think their own language is more ancient. Pakistan's Punjabis dislike those who speak Sindhi. By combining the word Sindhi with a rude adjective, they accuse them of committing incest with their sisters. So, historical patterns of language development continue to have daily consequences in both India and Pakistan. These distinctions of language and region have their roots in the distant past. Looking further back in history to the second millennium BC, we know that a civilization flourished in the valley of the Indus River. But scholars have not recovered enough information about it to give a precise description. Though we have artifacts and even the remains of entire cities, few written documents survived, and specialists cannot agree on a translation of those texts. So, for lack of more specific evidence, India's history begins with the later arrival of the Indo-Aryans. Aryan originally refers to a group of languages in which the word Aryan means the people. Alternate meanings are those who are like us, or the ones you don't kill upon meeting. This same basic root is the precursor of the Gaelic word for the Irish, Iran, and the name of the country, Iran. The Aryan settlers in India produced a collection of religious books known as the Vedas. The Vedas are a religious library, not a single book like the Holy Quran or a collection of books like the Judeo-Christian Bible. The hymns that form the earliest sections of the Vedas may go back as far as 1800 BC. These religious poems also are used in rituals, and most of them are dedicated to one of the hundreds of gods that the Indo-Aryans worshipped. One of these is the fire god Agni, and the following verses are typical.
I praise Agni, who is our household priest, who is the god who makes the sacrifice possible, who is the chief priest, the bestower of all blessings. Both the ancients and the moderns praise Agni, for he brings the other gods to our sacrifice. Because of Agni, we gain wealth. He gives us health and gives us many heroic sons.
Other hymns reveal a very different view of man, the earth, and the gods.
Who truly knows, and who will tell us here, how did this world come to be? How did this creation appear? The gods appeared after this creation. Who then knows how the world arose? Is this world eternal, or is it created? He who is the overseer in the highest heaven surely must know. Or perhaps even he does not know.
Vedic hymns devoted to a personal god stand alongside others that are nearly agnostic. More generally, completely opposite ideas and practices often coexist among India's many religious developments. India's religions usually coexist peacefully. More rarely, religious arguments lead to turmoil. The last books of the Vedic library, called the Upanishads, do not concern themselves with religion in a devotional way. Rather, they became more philosophical and less involved in the worship of a personal god. The Upanishads contain several ideas that most Americans associate with Indian religion. These include salvation through meditation and karma, or the idea that one's actions can affect both this life and future lives. In today's age, ideas about rebirth and karma concern mainly philosophers and religious specialists. Most Indians express their faith in devotional ways, not philosophical ways. Indian gods became popular in the 14th and 15th centuries, when Hinduism took on its modern form. Today, most Indians are devoted to Hindu gods and goddesses such as Shiva, Ram, Krishna, Vishnu, Kali, Parvati, Ganesh, or one of hundreds of others. Tulsidas, a 15th century saint, translated into Hindi the epic of Ram, known as the Ramayana. He also wrote devotional poetry to praise Ram, the God King. The following verse is fairly typical of the thousands of similar works by various authors devoted to one of the Indian gods.
The name of King Ram, think of it with love. It is sustenance for those who travel empty-handed, and a friend for those who travel alone. It is blessedness for the unblessed, good character for those who have none, a bridge which spans the sea of existence, and the cause of the essence of joy. Ram's name has no equal, rescuer of the fallen. The thought of it makes fertile earth from Tulsi's barren soil.
Some Indian thinkers, especially the Brahmin priests, wrote elaborate rules and regulations in an effort to create a balanced social system. Not surprisingly, they believed priests should be at the pinnacle of society. The most important function of all the other classes was to serve and support the priests. Warriors and kings, kshatriyas, were next most important, followed by merchants, vashyas, and finally by everyone else's servants, known as shudras. According to priestly theory, only the priests, warrior kings, and merchants were truly Aryans. They're supposed to go through a special ceremony of second birth to initiate them into the Aryan community. They also wear a sacred thread to signify that status. Those not born into any of those groups, or those with parents from two different orders, are completely outside the system. In priestly theory, they are forever impure. One should not touch them, or have any sort of close contact with them. To do so can cause ritual pollution, and removing it requires elaborate ceremonies. So these impure people are called untouchables. Most Americans know this social arrangement as the caste system. Even many intellectuals seem to think that caste is India, and India is caste. But we should be wary of quick and easy assessments, as one historian has warned.
Nobody can understand the caste system until he has freed himself from the mistaken notion that there were four original castes. No four original castes ever existed at any time and place. And at the present moment, the terms kshatriya, vaishya, and shudra have no exact meaning as a classification of existing subcastes.
Part of the problem stems from our vocabulary. Caste, for example, is not an Indian word, but comes from the Portuguese casta, meaning a house, family, or tribe. This term was commonly used by the British in the 19th century. But before this, Indians had used their own words to describe the priestly social ideal and the way they truly lived their lives. In practice, the most important group for South Asians is the subcaste, or jati. Jati literally refers to one's birth. People become part of a subcaste, or jati, by being born into it. Thousands of these subcastes exist. Different regions of India have unique groups, and the social ranking of the various subcastes differs from area to area. Because the vast majority of South Asians have always lived in the countryside, this is the best place to understand what's involved in the caste system. Most rural areas in India are dotted with villages and hamlets. Farmers rarely live on their own plots. One subcaste usually controls most of the land around a village. The group or caste acquires control of the land in one of two ways. It may have been the first group to cultivate the territory, or it may have the size and military skills to force other groups to farm the land for them. A Brahmin tells how a Rajput, that is, a jati of warriors, uses the forceful approach.
They get land little by little at least. Soon they refuse to pay rent and declare the lands to be their own. They collect bad characters to plunder. Invite the Rajputs of their own clan in all the villages around to join in their enterprises. Take to the jungles in the first occasion of a dispute. Attack, plunder, and burn the village. Murder us and our families. And soon get the estate for themselves, on their own terms, from the local authorities, who are worn out by the loss of revenue arising from the Rajputs' deprivations.
Until the 20th century, land was still readily available in South Asia. The overcrowding that most Americans associate with India began only around 1940 or 1950. So discontented groups in earlier times could move into new territories to escape oppressive conditions. Indian peasants traditionally have been pugnacious, and they don't easily submit to outside control. The British were the first governors of India powerful enough to subdue their villages. They often demolished village forts, and they managed to limit the peasants' access to guns. But even during the British dominion in India, villages remained prone to physical violence. The people still had clubs, swords, and a variety of lethal agricultural implements, and they traditionally surrounded their villages with thick mud walls that could withstand cannon fire. When land-controlling castes have broken into factions, a faction might abandon a village and set up a new one. Inter-village feuding often would follow, so violence has been endemic in rural India. In modern times, as people migrate from the countryside to the cities, they often bring their local conflicts with them. From time to time, a particular land-controlling caste has become powerful enough to assert its authority beyond a single village. The caste would then encompass 10, 20, or 80 villages. This was the beginning of many regional kingdoms, which became India's medieval and early modern states. Sometimes the members of a rising caste would consider themselves all to be equals. The kingdom was seen as the joint holding of everyone in the caste. The emerging states were, in effect, peasant republics. In other times, a particular family in the caste claimed superior status, and a Raja or a Maharaja arose. These became the heads of powerful families of aggressive, land-controlling castes. In India, kingdoms also arose when soldiers or even bandits conquered an area with the help of their followers. These little kingdoms were often short-lived, falling apart when the commander or chief bandit died. But the descendants of a predatory soldier sometimes thrived, and as time went by, they sometimes gained acceptance as legitimate rulers. Whatever the origin of a local ruler's authority, power has been distributed rather than centralized throughout India's history. Only a few groups, such as the untouchables, have been completely powerless. Yet even they have rebelled against their masters from time to time. Obtaining and exercising absolute power has been difficult. Challenges usually came from a ruler's close associates and from other competing castes. Most Americans think the Indian social hierarchy is fixed, that it has been unchanged for centuries. But the reverse is true. No group's status is secure forever. If a caste begins to lose its control of the land, it may lose the respect of its neighbors and eventually sink into obscurity. As one caste falls, another may rise as it gains control of more land or as it finds some new opportunity to increase its wealth and influence. Landholding has long been a path to social prominence in India, as have government and commerce. India has been the source of many highly prized goods, at least since the Roman period, when the country was famous for diamonds, other precious stones, and luxury items such as elegantly carved ivory and jewelry. There were extensive trading links to both the East and West. Colonies of Indian merchants lived in Burma, Thailand, and Indonesia. Arab, African, and Chinese merchants came to the west coast of India to acquire not only Indian goods, but spices transshipped from Java and Bali. For centuries, distinct castes managed both internal and international trade. These groups were not confined to one or two regions, but were dispersed throughout the subcontinent and in colonies overseas. India's complex mercantile relationships also created sophisticated financial systems. Even by modern economic standards, Indian merchants have long possessed complex business skills. They exchanged letters of credit, and they knew about the advantages of joint ventures and insurance. A historian has pointed to the complexity of those arrangements.
From the perspective of the merchants themselves, the basis for mercantile society was the family firm, its credit, and the totality of its relations with gods and men, creditors and debtors. Without credit, a family could not trade or call on merchant arbitration at all. Merchant corporations kept lists of creditable merchants, whose bills of exchange could expect rapid discount in the market. Even small dealers knew whose letters of credit were current and whose were not. In traditional commercial centers, the corporations imposed heavy penalties for breaches of trust.
Indian merchants and producers were fully prepared to take advantage of the opportunities which arose after May of 1498, when Vasco da Gama of Portugal sailed into the port of Calicut on India's west coast. In the next century and a half, India's widespread trading contacts expanded even further. Spices and precious stones were India's most famous commodities, and cotton cloth became highly prized. Like silk, cotton cloth was lightweight and took colorful dyes well, but its great advantage was its low cost. Cotton was heavily demanded in Europe, but it also played a key role in international exchange. For example, Indian cotton cloth became the favorite medium of exchange in the booming market for African slaves. In Africa, cloth could buy people. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europeans had few goods that Indians wanted. Europeans had to pay in silver to get Indian cloth, spices, or gems, so India experienced a tremendous inflow of bullion. Soon, the ruling powers found that they could collect most of their land taxes in silver coin. Even peasants had unprecedented amounts of money. India's fabled wealth brought Europeans to the subcontinent in the first place, and its wealth only increased with expanded trade. Contemporary Americans think of India as a poor country, but the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were a period of economic boom. India was rich, richer by far than Europe. Small-time traders became big-time merchants. Ordinary moneylenders grew to be prosperous bankers. In social terms, castes with modest status in India became internationally prominent, and the wealth flowing into South Asia also made its rulers more influential than any other rulers in the region's history. Trade was not the only way to gain power and prestige in India. Only a few enduring and extensive empires appeared in India's past. Yet the little kings had enough room to pursue their ambitions. The earliest recorded great dynasty was that of the Mauryas. This was a coalition of princes founded to oppose Alexander the Great, who invaded India in 326 BC. The Mauryas' empire ended when its last king was assassinated in 184 BC. The Gupta emperors ruled between 320 and 550 AD. Scholars still debate the extent of the Gupta domains and their influence on Indian history. Like the Mauryas before them, the Guptas were largely forgotten until 19th century archaeologists discovered evidence of their states. Empires that encompassed all of India were fairly rare, but many regional kingdoms had long and glorious histories, especially in the south. Northern kingdoms rose and fell so rapidly that often only their names survived. By contrast, only 4 dynasties controlled southern India for more than 1,600 years, from the 1st century BC until well past 1500 AD. These southern empires were loosely put together, and this may be why they lasted so long. Southern emperors did not infringe too much on their subjects, who recognized the ruler primarily as a ceremonial figure. Burton Stein, a leading historian of the region, has described the situation.
The medieval South Indian state was a segmentary state, in which political authority and control were local in several crucial ways. The scope of the constituent units of the state was limited to well-defined and persistent ethnic territories. Its chiefs were in most cases leaders or spokesmen of the dominant ethnic groups of the local territory. And perhaps most unique in South India, corporate bodies representing the interests of various folk of a locality participated in the public business of the locality.
American politicians are fond of saying all politics is local, and that's certainly true in India. The most important arrangements of power are those of the various regions and districts. At the local level, these arrangements are constantly shifting, and many forces change the balance of power. New castes may emerge, and the power of old castes may fade. A boom in a region's trade in cotton or sugar, for example, will redistribute wealth and thereby favor one group over another. But newcomers, immigrants, or conquerors can shift the local balance of power. This is an important consideration when we think of the Muslim impact on Indian history. The first Muslim invasion of India occurred in 750 AD, when an Arab force entered the Sindh region in the southwest. Islam's initial influence was limited to that area. More significant Muslim incursions came from the northwest in the 11th century AD. India historically has had strong ties with the areas that are now Afghanistan, eastern Iran, and the Central Asian republics, which later became part of the Soviet Union. People came south into India, yet Indians often ventured north of the Khyber Pass to wage war, and occasionally to rule in those lands. Toward the end of the 10th century, a number of new Muslim dynasties appeared in these northern regions. Most of them were Turkish. Some Turks served as soldiers and eventually succeeded their masters as kings. Often called sultans, these Turkish-speaking rulers soon were influenced by the Persian traditions of kingship and civilization. Persian was their court language. Some ambitious sultans wanted to be remembered as the sponsors of a sophisticated Islamic Persian culture. Sultan Mahmud ruled Ghazna, an area of present-day Afghanistan, from 997 to 1030 AD. He was one of those ambitious overlords. He was the son of Turkish soldiers, and he wanted to turn Ghazna into one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world, rivaling the legendary cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. Mahmud lavishly patronized poets and scholars from all over the Eastern Muslim world. If financial rewards failed to draw them, Mahmud was not above kidnapping. Among his clients was the poet Firdausi, author of the Persian national epic entitled The Book of Kings, or Shahnameh. Mahmud needed money to attract all that cultural talent. Ghazna's internal resources were limited, so Mahmud looked toward India's wealth. He sent his armies over the Hindu Kush mountains to raid the North Indian plain. Temples with treasuries full of gold and jewels dedicated to their idols were Mahmud's favorite target. A few generations after Mahmud, a Muslim historian described one of these conquests.
It is said that the Sultan Mahmud found in the city of Mutra 5 idols of purest gold with rubies for eyes, each of which was worth 50,000 silver coins. Upon each of these idols was a sapphire weighing 90 carats, and when those idols were melted down, they produced thousands of ounces of gold. Besides that, there were over 100 silver statues so heavy that 100 camels were required to carry them.
But in practice, Mahmud more than tolerated Hindus. He recruited Hindu troops for his army, appointed a number of Hindu generals, and allowed them to worship in their own way. Mahmud's raids affected the relationship between India and Muslim Central Asia for the next 200 years, until about 1200 AD. His dynasty died out, but other sultans took his place. Soon, instead of campaigning in India every year or two, the sultans began to leave garrisons in such cities as Lahore and Multan. Eventually, a sizable force was stationed at Delhi. Communication lines between India and Afghanistan became longer and longer, and local commanders became increasingly independent. One of these generals, Qutb-ud-Din Aibak, took advantage of an internal struggle within his master's dynasty. He declared in 1204 that he was now the independent Sultan of Delhi. From about 1200 AD until 1500 AD, Muslim kingdoms proliferated in India. Kings moved east from Delhi to Bengal. In the west, Muslims gained control of the Gujarat region and involved themselves in the lucrative West Coast trade. During the 14th century, Muslim kings began to rule in the Deccan and the south. But none of the sultanates was very stable. The longest-lived dynasties held their thrones for only 60 or 70 years. According to a strict interpretation of Muslim law, a Muslim king could offer his Hindu subjects only one choice. They could convert to Islam or be killed. Many Hindus gravitated to the courts of the sultans, allying themselves with the Muslims and adopting Muslim styles of dress and culture. But in reality, Hindus usually were tolerated, just as Mahmud of Ghazna had tolerated them. In the 19th century, political tensions became extreme. Only then did Hindus make it fashionable to stress Muslim cruelty and religious bigotry. These later tensions did not accurately reflect the cooperation that had characterized Hindu-Muslim relations for many centuries. Rajendra Prasad, a Hindu scholar, has described the need for a fair appraisal of Muslim rule.
It would be a useful service if some scholar could bring together a list of the numerous endowments and grants made by Muslim kings to Hindu temples and shrines, such as has been done of those desecrated or destroyed by them. The attitude of the Muslim conquerors had, on the whole, been one of toleration, and in spite of the fanatical zeal manifested by some of them at times, it may be safely asserted that there had been a continuous effort from the earliest days to deal with the Hindus fairly.
Muslims never constituted more than one-third of South Asia's population. India's Muslim population maintained its numbers partly through migration and partly by converting Hindus. India acquired a reputation in the Muslim countries to its west and north as a frontier. Conditions might be rough, but talent and initiative would be rewarded. Just as a similar reputation once encouraged migration to the American West, India's frontier drew immigrants from Afghanistan, Iran, Abyssinia, and Central Asia. Many immigrants were soldiers who wanted to parlay their military skills into wealth and power. Others were men of the pen, that is, religious scholars, poets, and bureaucrats seeking support from the kings and notables of India. Many immigrants found what they were looking for. Muslims scattered throughout the subcontinent, but they often congregated in cities. The great Muslim cities of Delhi, Agra, and Ajmer attracted them, but they also went to the smaller regional and district towns. These were known as market towns or kasbahs. The Indian sultans administered their fiefdoms there. Sometimes troops and officials managed to convert government appointments into private landholdings. They became part of the Muslim aristocracy, which in turn supported religious scholars, Sufis, physicians, and poets. Many Hindu Indians converted to Islam. Forced conversions were rare, so most converted freely. Converts tended to come either from the upper or lower reaches of society. Even the elite Hindu warriors felt a certain affinity between themselves and the Muslims. Warrior groups, such as the Rajputs, were in close contact with Muslims, and they turned to Islam slowly and almost imperceptibly. They sometimes began by adopting Muslim dress or Muslim customs. They would use the Persian language and the Arabic script. After a century or two, Indian Muslims could not be distinguished from foreign-born Muslims. Even some priestly groups adopted the new religion. Brahmins often served Muslim kings as scribes and accountants, and over time they were influenced by Islamic beliefs. Members of the lower classes, such as weavers and leatherworkers, were attracted to Islam's egalitarian teachings. All Muslims were and are supposed to be equals in the eyes of God. Hindus often considered Muslims to be unclean and socially inferior, but the Muslim ideal of equality gave converts at least the hope of being respected. Of course, their hopes were not always realized. Muslims can be just as snobbish as their Hindu neighbors, but the attraction remains strong even now. Groups of untouchables still convert to Islam on a regular basis. Muslims, though a minority, affected society far beyond their numbers. They ruled most of the subcontinent, so their power made them important. Mosques, tombs, shrines, and religious schools became a familiar sight. The Muslim call to prayer constantly reminded Hindus that Muslims were not only present, but often politically dominant. Even those Hindus who didn't convert to Islam adopted the cultural trappings of the Muslims. Lajpat Rai, who eventually became a Hindu communalist, described the education he received in the latter years of the 19th century.
My father taught me a good deal of Persian privately. I never learned Sanskrit and did not know even the alphabet of Hindi. With the Gurmukhi script of the Sikhs, I have no acquaintance to this day. The whole of my boyhood had been taken up by the study of Urdu, Persian, and Arabic.
Most conversions to Islam were accomplished through the teachings and by the example of Muslim mystics called Sufis. Sufis arrived from Iran and Central Asia as early as the 11th century. Almost every Indian region now boasts several famous saints. Some of the early Sufis were known as warriors, but most of them were peaceful. They appealed to the populace by setting an example. Sufis believe they have a close intuitive relationship with God. Many believe that God recognizes that special intimacy by giving them unusual powers, such as the ability to work miracles. When a great saint dies, his power does not dissipate, but is thought to remain close to the saint's body. So the tombs of these holy men have become shrines and centers of pilgrimage. Some of the saints have purely local followings, although others attract devotees from all over India, from Afghanistan, and from Central Asia. There is no typical style of Sufi belief and practice. Some strictly adhere to Muslim doctrine and discipline. They encourage their followers to say their prayers daily, learn the Holy Quran, fast in the month of Ramadan, and keep close to the Prophet's authoritative example. As one exponent of this approach notes,
The first step is the holy law. When the disciple has fully paid the demands of religion and aspires to go beyond, the path will appear to him. It is the way to the heart. When he has fully observed all the formal demands of the faith, daily prayer, fasting, and the like, and aspires to soar higher, the veils of the heart are rent, and the truth shines therein.
Other Sufis are much more radical. They argue that the love of God is the most important thing. They believe that prayer, fasting, and other regular Islamic practices are empty hypocrisy. The saints of this tradition sometimes have advocated the use of wine or hashish to induce mystical insight. Moreover, they've taught that Islam embraces everyone, whether or not they openly profess the religion. The popular Sufi saint Bulleh Shah has expressed this belief.
Neither Hindu nor Muslim. Let us sit and spin, abandoning the pride of religion. Neither Sunni nor Shiite. I have taken the path of peace and unity. Neither hungry nor full, neither naked nor clothed, neither weeping nor laughing, neither exiled nor settled, neither a sinner nor pure. I do not walk in the way of sin or virtue. Bulle, in all hearts I feel the Lord. So I have abandoned both Hindu and Muslim.
Muslim Sufis have often associated with Hindu holy men, sometimes adopting Hindu practices such as yoga. Even so, conversion to Islam can be a slow, almost unnoticed process. Hindus might gravitate to a Muslim saint because he resembles one of their own holy men. After the saint's death, they may keep coming to his tomb, thereby attracting other generations of Muslim mystics and teachers. In that way, individuals who were originally Hindus have become Muslims. Hindu-Muslim conflicts have characterized modern South Asian life, but they were relatively rare before the 19th century. Muslim preachers often urged the early followers to maintain Islamic purity in a land of idol worshippers. But even these revivalist thinkers seldom paid much attention to the Hindus living around them. And in these earlier times, Muslim thinkers occasionally even found something to praise about Hinduism.